The lifeblood of the Imperium is not faith, nor is it arms. It is the voice in the dark, the whisper that crosses the unbridgeable gulfs between stars. It is the agonizing, soul-straining cry of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica, a choir of souls whose collective sacrifice holds the million worlds of mankind together in a fragile, fraying tapestry. Without them, there is no Imperium. There is only the solitary madness of a million isolated systems, each left to die alone in the suffocating dark. And so, when a voice falls silent, the Imperium listens. It began on the fringe of the Ultima Segmentum, a quiet corner of space known as the Viridian Veil. The astropathic relay station on Cypra 4, a small, insignificant rock notable only for its stable warp currents, ceased its scheduled hymnal of transmission. In the vast, sclerotic bureaucracy of the administratum, it was noted as a minor equipment failure. A log was made. A maintenance request, destined to be processed in half a century, was filed. The Imperium, in its crushing inertia, did not notice. A standard month later, the choir on the hive world of Pellucida Major, 200 light-years chorward, fell silent. This was more concerning. Pellucida was a producer of munitions, a cog in the great war machine. Its silence was logged as a Vox system malfunction, cascade failure, priority gamma. Lord Admirals shifted fleet dispositions on star charts that were already years out of date. Still, the true nature of the event was missed. It was a statistical anomaly, a ripple in an ocean of data. It was when the entire Gethsemane subsector went dark that the pattern became undeniable. 36 worlds, each with its own astropathic choir, each winking out of the psychic consciousness of the Imperium over the course of a single week. They did not cry out in alarm. There was no final, panicked message of invasion or warp storm. They were simply there. And then they were not. The silence was absolute, a spreading stain of nothingness on the map of the galaxy. It was a silence that was not empty, but profoundly negative, as if the very fabric of psychic space in that region had been devoured. In a black stone spire on Ophelius VII, Lord Inquisitor Arian Vex of the Ordo, Hereticus stared at a celestial map projected by a flickering lumen orb. He was a man whose soul had been worn smooth by centuries of contemplating the manifold insanities of the galaxy. Yet this chilled him in a way no daemon or heretic ever had. It was the tidiness of it, the cold, implacable logic. The systems were not falling silent at random. They were being extinguished in a line, a terrifyingly direct path, aimed like a dagger at the heart of the segmentum solar. He gave the phenomenon a name, one that would be whispered in terror in the halls of the Holy Inquisition for millennia to come: the silent Blight. Far from the panicked halls of the Imperium, in the cold void where the Blight was born, the truth was infinitely more alien. It drifted through the interstellar dark, a fleet that was not a fleet, a collection of planetoid-sized vessels that were equal parts rock, scavenged technology, and living organism. At their heart was the war sphere, Grave Womb, a vessel that had once been a tow colony ship, then a Kroot war citadel, and was now something else entirely. Its metallic hide was overgrown with pulsating, chitinous growths. Bioluminescent nodules pulsed in rhythm with the slow, deep thrum of its engines. Its corridors were no longer sterile metal, but tunnels of hardened resin, slick with secreted ichor. Within these organic halls moved the kindred of the silent maw. They were Kroot, but a shadow of their former selves, remade into something far more terrible. Their lean avian frames were now bulked with slabs of striated muscle, plates of glossy black carapace looted from the genetic code of some forgotten Tyranid splinter fleet covered their bodies. Their quills were sharper, thicker, and dripped with corrosive biotoxins. Their eyes, once cunningly intelligent, now burned with the cold, unified light of a singular, unholy purpose. At the very heart of the grave womb, in a cavernous chamber that served as a throne room, temple, and synaptic nexus, sat Shaper Lord Cathok. The transformation had been most profound in him. He was immense, his body a grotesque fusion of Kroot physiology and Tyranid bioarchitecture. His back was a fortress of interlocking chitin, and 6 scythe-like limbs, grown from the memory of a hive tyrant's bones, lay folded at his sides. He did not sit on a throne, but was fused to it, a pulsating pillar of flesh and nerve bundles that plunged deep into the war sphere's core, making him one with his vessel. The story of their damnation, which they called their ascension, was one of hunger. Generations ago, their kindred, the Sky Stalkers, had been near extinction, lost, starving. They had stumbled upon a galactic graveyard, the wreckage of a hive fleet, shattered in a forgotten war against a Necron dynasty. Amidst the splintered bioships, they found a prize beyond imagining. The dying Norn queen of the splinter fleet, its immense body fractured, but its psychic heart still faintly beating. Driven by a desperation that overrode all caution, they did what Kroot have always done. They ate. They consumed the lesser organisms first, then the greater, and finally, Cathok himself the master shaper, led his inner circle into the Norn Queen's cerebral chamber. He devoured the very core of the creature, the nexus of its portion of the hive mind. The genetic assimilation was instantaneous and apocalyptic. It did not just change their bodies, it rewrote their souls. Cathak was inundated with a flood of alien consciousness, the collective memories and biological imperatives of a billion consumed worlds. He saw the universe not as a collection of territories, but as a ladder of biomass, an evolutionary path. And in the dying thoughts of the Norn Queen, he saw its final, unfulfilled directive, a psychic echo of a command that had spanned galaxies. He saw a point of light so bright it was a psychic sun. He saw a throne of gold and a being of unimaginable power. He saw Terra. To the fractured alien mind of the Norn Queen, it was the ultimate repository of biomass, the final feast that would ensure the hive mind's eternal dominance. But to Cathak, filtered through the Kroot's own innate drive to evolve, it became something more. A religious imperative, a holy crusade. He saw the being on the golden throne not as an enemy to be destroyed, but as the final, perfect strand of DNA required for the Kroot to achieve their ultimate form. To consume the God Emperor was not an act of war, but of holy assimilation, the sacred culmination of their entire species' purpose. He preached this new gospel to his reborn kindred. They were no longer mercenaries scrabbling for scraps. They were the silent Maw, and their destiny was to walk the stars and consume their way to divinity. But the path was long, and the warp was a mystery to them. The Norn Queen's genetic memory offered a solution. It held the knowledge of psychic resonance, of navigation through the Imperium, not by charts, but by instinct, by following the psychic lights of the galaxy. The astropaths of the Imperium, those lonely voices in the dark, became their lighthouses, their breadcrumbs, and their fuel. Each choir consumed was a feast that not only fed their ever-growing hunger, but provided the psychic energy and navigational data to make the next jump, plunging another system into the silent darkness that trailed in their wake. Aboard the grave womb, Shaper Lord Cathak stirred. A lesser shaper, its body covered in the vestigial wings of a tyrannid gargoyle, approached and bowed low. Prophet Shaper, it chittered in the reformed Kroot dialect, a tongue now laced with wet, clicking sounds. The feast at Choir Primus is complete. Our flesh vats are full. The way is known. They were staring into a space beyond reality, tracing the psychic currents of the void. He could taste the next light, a brilliant, tempting beacon on the path to the ultimate meal. "The great journey continues," Cathoc's voice boomed, not from his mouth, but directly into the minds of every Kroot in the fleet. "We walk the path of ascension. Make ready the void drives. Our hunger is the key. Our destiny is the throne." Marshal Gideus Crane stood on the observation deck of the Bastion Primus, his gaze fixed on the cold, gray orb of the planet below. Choir Primus was not a world of beauty or wealth. It was a tool, a function given form. Its continents were paved with fortifications, its mountains bristled with macro-cannon batteries, and its poles were crowned with gargantuan shield generators that shimmered like captive aurora. At its very equator, a single, impossibly tall structure pierced the thin atmosphere. The harmonic spire, a mile-high cathedral of pest-conductive crystal and sanctified steel. Within its shielded heart resided the choir of Saint Aster, 10,000 astropaths bound together in a psychic chorus whose lament carried the Emperor's light across the subsector. Now it was bait. Crine was a veteran of 100 campaigns. He had held the line against orc wogs and shattered the spear tips of Eldar raids. His command, the 88th Cadian Gatekeepers, were the inheritors of a legacy of iron discipline and unwavering faith. They were the finest soldiers he had ever led, and he had arrayed them in a flawless defense. 3 concentric rings of trench systems, minefields, and redoubts encircled the harmonic spire. Legions of Lehman Russ tanks were dug into hull-down positions, their cannons aimed at pre-sighted kill zones. The sky was thick with Valkyrie patrols, and the ground trembled with the latent power of a dozen full batteries of basilisk artillery. Choir Primus was no longer a relay station. It was a fortress, an anvil upon which this mysterious, silent Blight would be broken. The arrival of the enemy came without the usual fanfare of warp translation. There was no violent tear in reality, no surge of Empyrean energies. Instead, the space above Choir Primus seemed to bruise. Patches of void darkened, coalescing into shapes that bled into existence, their forms resolving into the grotesque fleet of the silent maw. Crane's augur technicians screamed reports of mass readings that defied classification. The ships were a blasphemous fusion of scavenged imperial hulls, tau geometry, and something hideously organic that pulsed with its own internal life. The Kroot did not bother with orbital bombardment. Their strategy was one of pure, shocking violence. Hundreds of misshapen landing craft, armored with thick, ablative chitin, detached from the fleet and plunged through the atmosphere. They ignored the flak-filled skies, absorbing punishing blows from the Hydra batteries that would have vaporized lesser vessels. They did not aim for strategic landing zones. They simply crashed. Great organic meteors slamming into the Imperial lines, their hulls cracking open to disgorge the horrors within. From his command bastion, Crane watched the picked feeds with a growing sense of professional unease. The first wave of creatures to emerge were recognizably Kroot, but larger. Their movements faster and more fluid than any mercenary kindred he had ever encountered. They flowed across the minefields with an uncanny grace, their bird-like legs carrying them over tripwires and pressure plates. The first line of Cadian trenches erupted in a storm of lasfire, a solid wall of energy that should have scythed the attackers down. The Kroot's black carapaces flared as the beams struck, deflecting and absorbing shots that would have punched through standard flak armor. They hit the Cadian line not as a disorganized charge, but as a coordinated wave, their Kroot rifles spitting explosive rounds with chilling accuracy. "Line holding, Marshal," Vox Officer Hask reported, his voice tight. "Heavy casualties on their side, but they keep coming." Crane nodded, his knuckles white on the railing. This was expected. Attrition. This was how the Guard won its wars. Tell batteries 1 through 5 to saturate grid Gamma 9. Turn that field into a crater. As the earth-shattering roar of the basilisks rolled across the plains, the second wave of Kroot emerged from the wreckage of their landers. And it was then that Crane's unease curdled into cold dread. These were not Kroot, as the Imperium knew them. Towering brutes, easily the size of an ogrin, their forms a nightmarish blend of Kroot sinew and Carnifex-grade armor plating, charged forward. Their arms had been replaced with massive, chitinous scythes that carved through razor wire barricades as if they were thread. Behind them came swarms of smaller creatures, running on all fours, their spines sprouting the distinctive spore chimneys of tyrannid organisms, trailing choking clouds of biotoxins that sent guardsmen clawing at their own throats, their rebreathers dissolving into useless slag. The disciplined fire of the Cadians began to waver. The Kroot brutes smashed into the trench lines, their scythes bisecting men in single, brutal strokes. The smaller swarms flowed over the parapets, a tide of rending claws and snapping beaks. But it was their unity that was most terrifying. There were no bellowed commands, no vox chatter. They moved with a silent, shared understanding, flanking, suppressing, and exploiting weaknesses with a speed and efficiency that felt utterly alien. They were a single predator, and the Cadian 88th was its prey. "Sector Primus is compromised," a voice screamed over the command channel. They are eating the dead. By the throne, they are eating our dead." Crane watched in horror as a picked feed showed a squad of Kroot warriors falling upon a downed Cadian sergeant. They tore at his flesh with a ravenous, systematic hunger, their bodies seeming to twitch and shudder as they assimilated the fresh biomass. Within seconds, the corpse was gone, stripped to a blood-stained skeleton. This was not the act of savages. It was a horrifyingly efficient battlefield resupply. The outer defensive ring collapsed in less than an hour. The second ring, anchored by the Lehman Russ squadrons, held for 3. The Kroot simply absorbed the punishment of the battle cannons, their largest bio-monstrosities acting as living shields, while swarms of hunters with glistening sacks on their backs swarmed the tanks, spitting streams of bioacid that melted through armor plating and cooked the crews inside their vehicles. The final stand was at the great adamantium gates of the harmonic spire. Tempestus scions, the elite of the elite, formed a grim line, their hot-shot lace guns turning the plaza before the spire into a charnel house. But for every Kroot they vaporized, 3 more took its place, their silent, unified advance utterly unnerving. They did not scream in rage or pain. They simply came, their eyes glowing with a cold, hungry light. The gates buckled, then shattered inwards. Marshal Crane drew his power sword, its energy field humming to life. He and his command squad prepared to sell their lives dearly. His last Vox transmission to the fleet in high orbit was grim. Bastion Primus has fallen. The enemy has breached the spire. Their objective is confirmed to be the astropathic choir. Sanction extremis. Purge this world. He never heard the reply. The wall of his command center imploded, and a creature that had once been a Kroot shaper, now a towering horror, with a crown of psionic veins, crackling with stolen power, filled the breach. Crane charged, the name of the Emperor on his lips. Inside the spire's apex sanctum, the scene was one of ultimate blasphemy. The 10,000 astropaths, frail figures in gray robes, huddled together, their minds already broken by the sheer psychic stench of the alien host. The Kroot warriors did not kill them with rifles or blades. They moved among them with a chilling reverence, their leaders selecting the most psychically potent. The chosen astropaths were held down, their mouths forced open as the Kroot lowered their own heads, a nest of writhing, fleshy tendrils emerging from their throats to plunge into the psyker's esophagus. There was a wet, slurping sound, a brief, silent scream in the warp, and the astropath would collapse, a hollow husk, their soul, their mind, their very psychic essence devoured. The Kroot crusade feasted. They consumed the choir, draining the light of Saint Aster from the subsector. They stripped the flesh from the tens of thousands of Cadian dead, their biochemistry working with terrifying speed to turn Imperial grit into Kroot muscle. And then, as suddenly as they had come, they were gone. Their misshapen ships lifted from the blood-soaked ground, leaving behind a world of absolute silence. When the first relief ships of the Imperial Navy translated into the system days later, they found no life signs. They found no broadcasts. They found a planet of pristine fortifications, littered with the clean-picked bones of its defenders. Choir Primus, the anvil of the Imperium, had been turned into an abattoir, its purpose served, its choir consumed. The silent Blight had taken another piece of the galaxy, and this Imperium had finally, truly seen the face of its new nightmare. In the antechamber of the inquisitorial fortress on Caris Cephalon, the air was as cold and still as a tomb. Lord Inquisitor Arian Vex stood before a vast oriel window, the star-dusted velvet of the void, his only companion. The loss of Choir Primus was not merely a strategic defeat. It was a conceptual horror. The Imperium was a body, and the Astra Telepathica was its nervous system. This new foe did not just sever limbs. It consumed the nerves, leaving behind dead flesh that did not even know it had been cut off. The picked logs and fragmented Vox recordings from Marshal Crane's last stand had been analyzed to the point of disintegration by 1,000 adepts. The conclusion was always the same. A species, the Kroot known only as second-rate mercenaries and scavengers, had somehow evolved, or been remade, into a foe of apocalyptic potential. Vex's solitude was interrupted by the hiss of a heavy adamantium door. He did not turn. He knew who it was. The scent of sanctified oils, ancient parchment, and the cold ozone of a barely suppressed power field preceded Lord Admiral Evangeline Bastion. She came to a halt 2 paces behind him, her immaculate white and gold uniform a stark contrast to Vex's sable robes. Her silence was a sign of respect and a question. "They move without a Geller field," Vex stated, his voice a dry rasp that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. "No conventional warp signature. Their method of transit is tied to their consumption of our psychers. They are not navigating the Empyrean. They are leaping between the psychic lighthouses we so foolishly built for them, and extinguishing them as they go. A parasite, Bastion said, her voice a low, resonant contralto, accustomed to commanding voidsmen across the clangor of a battleship's bridge. It uses our own lifeblood to travel through our veins, killing as it goes. Precisely, Lord Admiral. Vex turned, his face a mask of grim resolve, his augmetic eye glowing a soft, menacing crimson. Which is why your task is not merely a crusade of retribution. It is a hunt for a ghost in a graveyard of your own making. You will be hunting an enemy that actively blinds you. With every system they consume, your ability to track them, to communicate, to call for aid, will diminish. The sheer scale of the undertaking was breathtaking in its audacity and desperation. The High Lords of Terra, their hands forced by Vex's stark and uncompromising report, had sanctioned the assembly of a fleet not seen in this segmentum for centuries. Battlefleet Pacificus was stripped bare. Tithes were called in from forge worlds that had not seen a Lord Admiral's seal in a millennium. Entire chapters of the Adeptus Astartes were recalled from distant campaigns. It was a crusade, a holy war against the encroaching silence, and it was christened with a name of Grim Hope, the Blind Crusade. Its fleet, a spear of over 200 capital ships and their myriad escorts, was named the Shield of Sol, a name that was both a promise and a prayer. At the heart of this armada was Evangeline Bastion's flagship, the Divine Right, an Emperor-class battleship that had traded blows with Abaddon's planet killers and survived. It was a vessel of legend, a kilometer-long cathedral of war, its spires and buttresses bristling with lance batteries and weapons emplacements that could crack a continent. Now, it was the command center for the most difficult hunt in Imperial history. The logistical challenges were a nightmare that would have broken a lesser commander. How do you patrol a region of space that is rapidly expanding and psychically featureless? How do you maintain supply lines to a fleet that could at any moment find itself cut off from all communication? The Administratum Adepts, buried in mountains of data slates, proposed complex patrol routes, probability matrices, and astromantic divinations. Bastion swept them all aside with a single, decisive gesture across the star chart in the Divine Right's strategium. "We cannot chase a shadow," she declared to her assembled captains, a grim-faced gallery of the finest naval minds in the sector. "We must predict where the shadow will fall. The enemy feeds on psychers. They will not strike at random. They will move from one feast to the next, following the brightest lights. We will not patrol the dark. We will fortify the light. Her strategy was a colossal gamble. It conceded vast swaths of territory to the Kroot, abandoning countless worlds in the silent Blight's path to their fate. But it conserved the strength of the Shield of Soul, turning it from a scattered patrol into a concentrated hammer, ready to fall. Astropathic choirs across 3 subsectors were designated as strategic assets. Those on worlds deemed indefensible were evacuated in a fleet of black ships, a grim harvest of souls that was its own kind of tragedy. The choirs on fortress worlds and shrine worlds, however, were reinforced. Regiments of Astra Militarum, titans of the Collegia Titanica, and companies of Astartes were poured onto these designated anvil worlds, turning them into fortresses intended to bleed the Kroot crusade dry. The muster of the fleet at the Cygnus X-1 naval base was a sight of terrible grandeur. The void glittered with the plasma fires of 1,000 ships. Lunar-class cruisers, their armored prows bearing the scars of forgotten wars, took on munitions from lumbering forge ships. Sword-class frigates, sleek and predatory, moved in wolf packs through the forest of larger vessels. The chapter barks of the Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, and the Silver Skulls stood apart, monolithic vessels of gold, black, and silver. Their very presence a testament to the gravity of the mission. Lord Admiral Bastian stood on the bridge of the Divine Right, watching the final elements of her fleet fall into formation. It was an instrument of immense power, a force capable of scouring entire star systems, and yet she felt a profound sense of fragility. They were sailing into a sea of silence, their only guide the dying screams of worlds left behind them. Their enemy was not a rebel or a heretic who could be reasoned with or intimidated. It was a hunger, a biological imperative given fleet and claw. All ships report readiness, Lord Admiral, her flag captain reported, his voice betraying a hint of awe. The Shield of Soul is formed. Vex stood beside her, a dark shadow amidst the crisp uniforms and gleaming consoles of the bridge. They have consumed another system, Lord Admiral. Obscurus 9, a minor agri-world, but its choir was strong. Their path remains constant. He pointed a gauntleted finger at the star chart, where a red rune pulsed with malevolent light. It lay directly on the projected path of the Blight. Gathalamor. Bastian's jaw tightened. Gathalamor, a cardinal world, second only to Ophelia VII in its spiritual significance to the sector. A world of 1 trillion faithful souls, its continents covered in cathedrals and reliquaries, and at its heart, the Cathedral of Celestial Hymns, home to one of the largest and most powerful astropathic choirs beyond the Sol system. It was not just a lighthouse, it was a psychic supernova, an irresistible feast for a creature like the Silent Maw. It is not just an anvil, Inquisitor, Bastion said, her eyes fixed on the rune of Gathalamor. It is the bait, the trap, and the executioner's block, all in one. If we cannot stop them there, then the path to Holy Terra itself lies open. She turned to her flag captain, her voice ringing with an authority that banished all doubt. Signal the fleet. Set course for the Gathalamor system. Maximum speed. The blind crusade has begun. As the colossal fleet began to move, its component ship turning in graceful, silent arcs to face their new heading, a single thought echoed in the minds of both the Lord Admiral and the Lord Inquisitor. They were leading the greatest concentration of Imperial might this region had ever seen. And they were utterly, terrifyingly blind. They could only sail towards the next scream and pray to the God Emperor that they would not be too late. Gathalamor was a world made of prayer. For 10,000 years, its continents had been sculpted not by geology, but by faith. Mountains were carved into the likenesses of saints, their peaks crowned with 1,000-bell carillons that sang the Emperor's praise across entire hemispheres. Rivers were rerouted to flow in patterns that mirrored Holy Scripture when viewed from orbit. Its cities were not sprawling hives, but concentric rings of cathedrals, shrines, and monasteries, each a masterpiece of Gothic architecture designed to draw the eye and the soul ever upward. It was a world where the very air was thick with the scent of incense and the ceaseless murmur of 1,000,000,000,000 faithful souls whispering litanies. It was a jewel of the ecclesiarchy, a beacon of faith in the dark. And it was about to become a slaughterhouse. The preparations for war were a holy crusade in themselves. Under the direction of the newly arrived Cadian 101st, the Unbroken, a regiment pieced together from the shattered remnants of a dozen others lost in the fall of Cadia. The planet's landscape was systematically and brutally remade. Pilgrims who had come to Gathalamor to die in peace were given shovels and lass cutters and organized into labor corvées by stern-faced commissars. The sacred groves were clear-cut to create overlapping fields of fire. The beautiful mosaic-paved plazas were churned into muddy trench lines, their intricate patterns of saints and martyrs vanishing under layers of razor wire and plasteel barricades. It was a desecration in the name of salvation, a necessary sacrilege. Command of the ground defense was a tense duarchy. Colonel Arvin Cord of the 101st was a man forged in the fires of the Cadian Gate. He was pragmatic, grim, and saw the universe in terms of filing arcs, logistical chains, and acceptable casualty rates. To him, Gathalamor's faithful masses were a liability, a drain on resources, and an obstacle to creating the perfect, layered kill zone. His counterpart was Canoness Superior Helena Vorn of the Order of the Argent Shroud. Her silver power armor polished to a mirror sheen, her face a mask of serene fury. She saw the population as the world's greatest weapon, a shield of faith, a wellspring of righteous hatred that would drown the alien in its fervor. Your trenches desecrate the sanctum of the Emperor's tears, she had stated to Cord, her voice dangerously calm as they stood over a tactical hololith displaying the capital city, Sanctum. You have turned a holy place into a mud pit. I have turned it into a fortress, Canoness, Cord had replied, not bothering to look up from the display. Your saints will be better protected by 3 feet of ferrocrete and a heavy bolter emplacement than by prayer alone. The enemy that is coming does not care for your relics. You are wrong, Colonel, Vorn had countered, her gauntleted fist clenching. It is faith that will break them. My sisters will hold the line at the Basilica of the Penitent. We will not yield a single sacred stone. This ideological clash defined the defense. Cord's Cadians built a brutal, efficient meat grinder, a series of defensive rings that stretched for 50 miles around the capital, designed to bleed an attacker white through sheer attrition. Vorn's battle sisters, meanwhile, fortified the holy sites themselves, turning every cathedral and reliquary into a bastion of faith and fire, their ramparts adorned with fluttering prayer strips and the flayed skins of heretics. The 2 strategies, one of cold logic and one of burning faith, transformed the city of Sanctum into the most formidable trap the sector had ever seen. At the city's very heart, and the Kroot's ultimate prize, was the Cathedral of Celestial Hymns. It was a structure that defied reason, a mountain of black marble and stained glass whose primary spire was so tall that it was perpetually wreathed in clouds. Deep within its core, shielded by void shields and meters of adamantium, lay the Imperium choir, their sanctum a vast, spherical chamber lined with the 10,000 psychers whose combined mental light was the target of the silent maw. The defense of the cathedral was given to the best of both commanders. Cord's own veteran, Kasurkin, shock troops, and Vorn's elite Celestian Guard. It was the final redoubt, the place where the battle, and perhaps the war, would be won or lost. The arrival of the Kroot was a violation. Their fleet did not appear with the thunder of imperial warships, but seeped into reality like a stain of oil on water. The grotesque, semi-organic war spheres hung in the sky above Gathalamor, their very presence a blasphemy against the perfectly ordered heavens. They blotted out the holy constellations, their misshapen hulls seeming to pulse with a predatory, biological rhythm that was the antithesis of the world's sanctified stone. For a full day, they did nothing, a fleet of silent, patient vultures. Then the assault began. It was not a rain of kinetic kill rods or a storm of torpedoes. It was a downpour of flesh. Thousands upon thousands of chitinous landing craft detached and burned through the atmosphere, but unlike at Quire Primus, they did not strike the defensive lines. They bypassed cords, carefully laid outer kill zones entirely, arcing over the trenches and minefields. They slammed down directly into the sprawling pilgrim camps and shanty towns that huddled at the foot of the city walls, and into the grand cemeteries and memorial gardens within the city's outer consecrata. The slaughter was immediate and horrific. The Kroot were not fighting an army. They were harvesting. The creatures that emerged, the now familiar horrors of carapaced hunters and scythe-limbed brutes, fell upon the largely unarmed civilian population with a terrifying efficiency. It was not a battle, but a processing of biological matter. Cord was forced to watch on the pict feeds as his outer defenses were rendered irrelevant, the enemy having landed behind his first ring and begun to feed. "They are ignoring our forces," he growled, his hands clenched on the railing of his command bunker. "They're fueling up on the soft targets before they engage. They are drawn to the places of the dead." Canoness Vorn's voice cut through the vox, laced with a new, chilling understanding. The psychic residue of generations of the faithful. They are not just feeding their bodies, Colonel. They are feeding something else. As the Kroot gorged themselves, a new wave of landers descended, this time targeting the fortified shrines and basilicas held by the Argent Shroud. Here, the harvest was contested. The Sisters of Battle met the charging Kroot with a storm of bolter fire, their explosive rounds tearing the lesser creatures apart. Vorn herself, wielding the blessed blade of Saint Aspera, stood on the steps of the Basilica of the Penitent, her white and silver armor already stained with black alien ichor. She was a vision of righteous wrath, her blade cleaving through chitinous armor as she screamed litanies of hatred. Yet even here, the Imperials were faced with a foe beyond their comprehension. The Kroot did not falter. They did not break. They climbed over the mountains of their own dead, their advance relentless. A new variant appeared, a lithe, skittering creature with elongated limbs that allowed it to scale the sheer cathedral walls with terrifying speed, bypassing the kill zones on the ground to strike at the sisters, holding the bell towers and high buttresses. The battle for Gathalamor had begun not with a clash of armies, but with the desperate defense of 1,000 holy sites. A sprawling, chaotic war fought in cloisters and catacombs, nave and sanctuary. On the blood-slicked plaza before the basilica, Canoness Vorn decapitated a hulking Kroot brute, its massive body crashing down amidst her Celestian guard. She looked up at the sky, at the profane fleet that had turned her sacred world into a charnel house. Her faith was a cold, hard diamond in her soul, absolute and unbreakable. But for the first time, looking at the silent, unified purpose of the advancing horde, she felt the touch of a truly alien intellect, a hunger so vast and so patient, it felt like a force of nature. This was not a war for territory or resources. It was a war of consumption, and her entire world was the intended feast. The turning point on Gathalamor was not marked by the fall of a bastion or the breach of a wall. It was not a sound of cannons, but a wave of absolute silence that heralded the true horror. As the third day of grinding, attritional warfare bled into a night lit by the fires of 100 burning shrines, a new presence made itself felt on the battlefield. It was an event so profound and so alien that it would be forever seared into the memories of the few who survived it. Aboard the grave womb in high orbit, Shaper Lord Cathach stirred from his communion with the vessel's living core. He had feasted on the psychic echoes of Gathalamor's dead, on the ambient spiritual energy of 1 trillion prayers, and on the potent, concentrated souls of the astropaths from Choir Primus. The energies coalesced within him, a fusion of tyrannid synapse power and stolen human faith. The Norn Queen's genetic memory had shown him how to weaponize belief, how to twist the psychic emanations of his prey back upon them. He was not merely a general directing a battle. He was the conductor of an orchestra of psychic dread. He drew a deep, shuddering breath, and on the surface of Gathalamor below, reality wavered. Colonel Cord was in the forward command bunker of the 2nd defensive ring, the air thick with the stink of promethium and overworked vox casters. The battle had devolved into a brutal, close-quarters slugging match. The Kroot, engorged on the biomass of the outer city, were now throwing themselves against the Cadian lines in relentless waves. For every meter of trench they took, they paid for it with a mountain of their own carapaced bodies. It was a battle Cord understood, a battle of numbers and fire discipline. He was holding. He was winning. Then the Voxnet died, not with a crackle of static or the scream of an override signal, but with an utter, profound emptiness. It was as if every transmitter on the planet had ceased to exist. In the sudden, ringing silence of the bunker, Cord felt a pressure build against his skull, a psychic weight that felt like drowning in cold oil. A low, bass thrumming began to vibrate through the ferrocrete floor, a sound that was felt more than heard. "What in the Emperor's name was that?" his master of ordnance demanded, his hand clamped to the side of his helm. Outside, the world had gone mad. A Cadian heavy bolter team pouring devastating fire into an advancing Kroot horde suddenly faltered. The gunner, a veteran named Pike with a decade of service, screamed and dropped the weapon's trigger. His eyes were wide with a terror that had nothing to do with the aliens before him. He saw the Kroot, but their forms were overlaid with a psychic phantasm. He saw them as shining, golden figures, their avian features softened into beatific, angelic visages. He saw the God Emperor, not on his throne, but walking among them, his hand raised in blessing. "He is with them," Pike whispered, a tear tracing a path through the grime onto his cheek. "The Emperor walks with the star born." He turned the heavy bolter on his own commissar, his face alight with insane, ecstatic revelation, and pulled the trigger. This scene was repeated 1,000 times along the front. The psychic projection from Cathach was not a crude blast of fear or rage. It was a targeted, exquisitely crafted, mimetic weapon, forged from the devoured faith of Gathalamor itself. It did not seek to terrify the Imperial defenders. It sought to convert them. It wormed its way into the cracks in their souls, showing them visions tailored to their deepest beliefs and fears. Guardsmen saw their comrades as demons, and the Kroot as avenging angels. Tech priests saw the Omnissiah's divine blueprint in the Kroot's horrific biological adaptations and began dismantling their own defensive turrets in a fervor of worship. Even the Frateris militia, whipped into a frenzy of faith by ecclesiarchy preachers, were not immune. They saw the Kroot as the Emperor's divine hunger made manifest, a holy scourge sent to purify the galaxy, and charged not at the aliens, but at the Cadian lines, their improvised weapons raised in a new, blasphemous crusade. Cathach called it the shadow of the maw. It was a localized psychic miasma, a bubble of weaponized belief that settled over the capital city of Sanctum. Within its confines, loyalty was meaningless. Faith was a weapon turned against itself. The disciplined, interlocking structure of the Imperial Guard dissolved into a chaotic bedlam of friendly fire, mass desertions, and suicidal, worshipful charges into the enemy's embrace. Only the Sisters of the Argent Shroud, their faith an unyielding shield of adamantium will, were able to resist the full, corrupting power of the maw. But even they were not unscathed. Canoness, Vorn, standing on a barricade of saints' statues and dead Kroot, felt the psychic pressure as a physical force. It clawed at her mind, whispering temptations, showing her visions of a galaxy where the human form was shed, where humanity ascended to a higher state by merging with the Kroot. A future free of pain, doubt, and death. It was a heresy so profound, so seductive, that it took all her centuries of training and iron-willed devotion to cast it out. But her sisters were not all as strong. She watched in horror as a Celestian, her eyes bleeding black tears, turned her bolter upon her squad mates, screaming that they were blind to the Emperor's new, glorious form. Vorn was forced to cut her down with her own blessed blade, the act a deeper wound to her soul than any physical blow. The shadow of the maw did not just kill, it damned. From his orbital throne, Cathach savored the symphony of terror, confusion, and breaking faith. He was the Norn Queen reborn, but with a craftsman's touch. The Tyrannid hive mind was a blunt instrument of pure will. Cathach's new power was a scalpel, dissecting the very soul of his enemy. He could feel the imperial lines wavering and breaking, not from overwhelming force, but from a cancer of the soul that was spreading through their ranks. The Cadian defenses, so brilliantly constructed by Colonel Cord, fell apart from the inside. Regiments turned on each other. Artillery batteries, their crews driven mad by visions of angelic hosts, began shelling their own command posts. Cord was forced to abandon his bunker, his Kasserkin bodyguard fighting a desperate battle not only against the advancing Kroot, but against waves of guardsmen whose eyes glowed with the same cold, unified light as the aliens. The voice of Cathach, a telepathic boom that shattered the sanity of those who heard it, rolled across the battlefield. It was a voice of pure, predatory hunger, cloaked in the stolen language of prophecy and salvation. Your flesh is a cage. Your faith is a lie told by a corpse god. I offer the true ascension. Cast aside your weak forms. join the great feast. Become one with the maw. In consumption, there is eternity. The battle for Gathalamor was no longer a military engagement. It had become a war for the soul of every human on the planet. And under the suffocating, psychically poisonous shadow of the maw, it was a war the Imperium was losing, with the imperial command structure fracturing under the psychic assault of the shadow of the maw. The second phase of the Kroot invasion began. It was an unveiling, a gruesome debut of the masterworks Cathak's kindred had sculpted from their own flesh and the stolen genetic lore of the Tyranids. The battlefield of Gathalamor, already a nightmare of fratricide and maddening whispers, was about to become a crucible for a new and terrible form of biological warfare. From the largest of the crashed landers, creatures of impossible scale began to emerge. They were not dropped into the heat of battle, but were birthed onto the field from pulsating, membranous sacs slick with amniotic fluid and the blood of the recently consumed. The Imperial defenders, their chain of command shattered, could only stare in disjointed horror as these new abominations rose to their full, terrifying height. They were dubbed Kroot Carnifexes by the few Vox casters still loyal and sane enough to report. Each was a walking siege engine, a 20-foot-tall horror of muscle, bone, and chitin. Their basic Kroot form was still visible, but grotesquely warped and scaled up. Their legs were thick as tree trunks, ending in 3-toed feet that cracked the sacred flagstones with every step. Their torsos were encased in massive, overlapping plates of black carapace, thick enough to shrug off crack missiles. In place of arms, they sported a variety of biomorphic weapons. Some had immense, crushing claws, cobbled together from the genetic memory of Carnifexes and Tyrant Guard. Others wielded huge, bone scythes that dripped with corrosive acids. Most terrifying of all were those whose arms had been replaced with symbiotic weapon organisms, huge, pulsating sacs of flesh that could hurl a volley of bone shards with the force of a heavy bolter, or vomit a stream of incandescent bioplasma that melted ferrocrete bunkers into slag. These behemoths strode into the fray, ignoring the scattered lass fire that peppered their hides. They were living, battering rams, and they associated through the Cadian defensive lines that had held for 3 days, their immense weight and power turning trenches into ditches and redoubts into rubble. A Leman Russ demolisher, its crew having resisted the psychic madness, fired its main cannon at point-blank range into the chest of one of the creatures. The shell detonated with a deafening boom, blasting a crater of smoking flesh and shattered chitin from the monster's torso. For a moment, it staggered. Then, with a spasm of hyper-accelerated regeneration, the wound sealed itself in a riot of twitching new muscle and rapidly hardening carapace. The Kroot carnifex roared, a sound that was half avian screech and half tyrannid shriek, and brought its crushing claw down on the tank's turret, collapsing it like a tin can. But the true genius of Cathoc's design was not in these lumbering brutes. It was in the tier of creatures that directed them. These were the synapse shapers, Kroot, who had been selectively bred and force-fed a diet of tyrannid warrior and lictor biomass. They were taller and leaner than the standard Kroot hunter, their hides a pale, almost translucent white. Their heads were crowned with elegant, sweeping crests of bone, and their eyes, all four of them, glowed with a palpable psychic energy. They carried no rifles, only long, staff-like bone zords that hummed with bioelectric force. These synapse shapers moved with a predatory grace, staying just behind the front lines of the main horde. They did not shout or use hand signals. Instead, they acted as psychic relays, conduits for Cathoc's will. They received the Prophet Shaper's grand strategic imperatives from orbit and translated them into specific, localized commands for the lesser Kroot. A flick of a synapse shaper's wrist, a subtle telepathic push, and a pack of Kroot hounds would peel off from the main assault to flank a heavy weapons nest. A low hum from its cranial crest, and a squad of Kroot hunters would lay down a perfect pattern of suppressing fire, allowing a Kroot carnifex to advance unhindered. This new, silent command structure was the final nail in the coffin of the Imperial defense. Colonel Cord, rallying what few loyalist Cadians he could find for a desperate defense of the final gate before the Cathedral of Celestial Hymns, found his tactical acumen utterly useless. He would order a fallback to a new position, only to find the Kroot were already there, anticipating his move. He would set up an ambush in a narrow cloister, but the Kroot would avoid it, taking a different, longer route, as if they had been warned. It was like fighting an opponent who could read his mind. The Vox network, already crippled by the shadow of the Maw, became a weapon against the Imperium. The synapse shapers, with their stolen tyrannid abilities, could intercept and interpret Imperial communications. More than that, they could project their own chittering, telepathic commands onto the same frequencies. A guardsman huddling in a trench would hear a calm, Cadian-accented voice over his bead vox order him to advance, only to realize, too late, that it was a psychic phantom luring him into a kill zone. The carefully orchestrated fire plans of the remaining basilisk batteries became useless as their targeting data was subtly altered by psychic interference, causing shells to fall harmlessly wide, or in some cases, directly onto friendly positions. Canoness Vorn and her Argent Shroud, their faith still a bulwark against the psychic miasma, found themselves fighting a new kind of war. Their bolters were effective against the rank-and-file Kroot, but the synapse shapers were another matter. These creatures were preternaturally swift, their movements a blur. They could dodge bolter shells and deflect chainsword strikes with their bioelectric blades. Worse, they could project targeted psychic attacks, short, sharp bursts of pure terror or confusion that could overwhelm even a sister's conditioning for a fatal second. Vorn watched as one of her retributors, a warrior of legendary piety, suddenly screamed and clawed at her own helmet, convinced a swarm of psychic insects were crawling inside her armor, a moment's distraction that allowed a synapse shaper to dart in and impale her on its bone zord. The Imperial army on Gathalamor was no longer an army. It was a collection of isolated pockets of terrified soldiers and faithful zealots, fighting against a foe that was not just a horde, but a single, thinking organism. The Kroot were a living web, with the mindless hunters as the threads, the Kroot carnifexes as the mailed fists, and the synapse shapers as the cunning nerves, all of it controlled by the spider-like consciousness of Cathach in the heavens above. The rigid, hierarchical command of the Astra Militarum and the unwavering but inflexible faith of the Adepta Sororitas were completely outmaneuvered by this fluid, silent, and terrifyingly intelligent hive mind. The fall of Athalamor was now an inevitability. The only question was how many souls would be consumed in its final, agonizing moments. While Gathalamor burned, the shield of Sol fleet plowed through the cold, silent void. Aboard the Divine Right, Lord Admiral Evangeline Bastion lived in a state of controlled frustration. Her command was a spear of unimaginable power, yet it felt like she was trying to stab a ghost in a hurricane. For weeks they had traveled, guided only by the fading psychic echoes of the Kroot's atrocities and the cold calculations of her strategos. They were perpetually behind, always arriving to find another world stripped bare, another system plunged into the terrifying stillness of the Blight. Gathalamor was to be different. It was the designated anvil. The fleet was the hammer. But as they drew closer, the lack of any communication was a screaming void in the heart of the crusade. Deep in the adamantium bowels of the flagship, far from the pristine order of the bridge, lay the cryostasis chambers and bio-quarantine labs of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Here, Magos Explorator Ven presided over his single, priceless treasure, Specimen Kappa 7, the designation for a Kroot body recovered during a high-risk reconnaissance sweep of the Choir Primus disaster zone. It had been found amidst a pile of its own kind, seemingly dead, its carapace cracked, and its visible flesh cold. Vhen, a being of cold logic and colder steel, saw it not as a fallen foe, but as a data set waiting to be unlocked. For weeks, the specimen had remained inert in its stasis field, its biological signs negligible. But as the fleet neared the psychic turbulence surrounding Gathalamor, something changed. Faint neural impulses began to flicker within the creature's complex alien brain. Vehen, his optical sensors whirring with delight, ordered the specimen moved to a primary vivisection chamber for immediate analysis. He believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough, a discovery that would unravel the mystery of this new Kroot bioform. The creature was laid out on a great steel slab, its limbs clamped down, its form illuminated by harsh, sterile lumen strips. It was one of the synapse shapers, though Ven did not yet know the significance of this. He saw only a fascinatingly divergent phenotype, its cranial crest and slender limbs a puzzle to be solved with scalpel and bioprobe. Begin neural stimulation, sequence gamma, Vhen intoned, his voice a metallic rasp. Record all synaptic responses. I want to know how their command structure functions. As the delicate probes touched the creature's temples, sending a microvolt of energy into its brain, it did not awaken. It died. But its death was not a simple cessation of life. It was a final, pre-programmed, and utterly malicious act of psychic warfare. The creature's body convulsed once, a violent, rigid spasm, and then it unleashed the totality of its stolen and perverted psychic energy in a single, silent, focused scream. On the bridge, consoles flickered, and astropaths clutched their heads, blood trickling from their noses. Servitors momentarily froze, their circuits overloaded. But the blast was not a crude explosion. It was a needle, a psychic lance aimed not at the ship's crew, but at the most sensitive and vulnerable minds aboard, the navigators. High in the navigator's spire, a tower of arcane technology and cloistered tradition that pierced the ship's dorsal hull, Paternova Auriax Khan was in communion with the Astronomicon. His private sanctum was a chamber of unsettling geometry, hung with silks that shimmered with impossible colors. He was a creature of immense power and profound fragility. His ancient, mutated body, little more than a life support system for the single, baleful third eye that stared unblinking from his forehead. Through that eye, he gazed upon the madness of the warp, charting a safe course through its lethal currents by the distant, golden light of the Emperor. It was a burden that had stretched his sanity thin over centuries of service. The psychic scream of the dying synapse shaper did not hit him as a painful assault. It bypassed his mental wards and slipped into his consciousness like a familiar hymn. It did not carry terror. It carried a message, a vision, a gospel of horrifying clarity. Auriax Khan saw the Empyrean not as a chaotic sea of demons and madness, but as a flawed, corrupted medium. He saw the Astronomicon not as a beacon of hope, but as a single, guttering candle in a tempest, a desperate and inefficient anchor. Then the vision shifted. He saw the universe as Cathach saw it, a great, dark web, and at the nodes of this web were points of psychic light. The choirs, the psychers, the very souls of the Imperium. And he saw a new way to travel, a clean way, not by plunging into the filth of the warp, but by leaping from point of light to point of light, consuming each one to fuel the next jump. It was a vision of order, of purity, of a perfect, silent journey across the void, free from the caprice of the ruinous powers. It was a path of evolution, and its final destination was the brightest light of all, the sun of Terra, where the ultimate consumption would lead to ultimate apotheosis. The vision was not an order. It was a logical proof, an undeniable truth presented to a mind already weary of chaos. He and his kin were not being enslaved. They were being enlightened. They were the gatekeepers, the wayfinders, and they had just been shown the true path. When the Paternova next convened with his navigator house, the change was subtle, but absolute. The constant fear that haunted their deep-set eyes was replaced by a serene, unnerving certainty. Their arcane discourse was no longer of warp tides and Geller field fluctuations, but of harmonic pathways and synaptic resonance. They had become converts to the religion of the silent maw. Lord Admiral Bastion, her brow furrowed with worry over Gathalamor's silence, received a priority alert from the Auspex arrays on her forward picket ships. A large Kroot fleet, smaller than the one besieging the Cardinal world, but still a significant threat, had been detected lurking in the treacherous asteroid fields of the Oort cloud at the system's edge. It was a classic ambush predator tactic. "Paternova Khan," she voxed to the navigator spire. "I need a new course, a short, blind jump, to bypass the Oort cloud and bring us into a high-orbit attack vector over Gathalamor. Can it be done?" There was a pause. Then the Paternova's voice, smoother and more confident than she had ever heard it, replied, "It can, Lord Admiral. The currents are favorable. There is a clear, stable path that will place you precisely where you wish to be. I will relay the coordinates." Trusting in the centuries-old sanctity of the Navis Nobilitae, Bastion gave the order. The colossal engines of the Shield of Sol fleet groaned. The air crackled with the energy of 1,000 Geller fields, powering up. And with a lurch that twisted space-time, the Crusade fleet plunged back into the warp. They emerged not into the clear void above Gathalamor, but into the heart of a dense, gravitic minefield in a forgotten corner of the system. The jump was precise, but the destination was a lie. Vast, silent mines, remnants of some ancient war, drifted in their path. Several escort frigates were vaporized instantly as they materialized directly on top of them. Larger cruisers suffered catastrophic hull breaches. And as alarms blared across the bridge of the divine right, and the fleet struggled to disentangle itself from the gravitic trap, the Kroot scout fleet emerged from the gloom of a nearby dust cloud, their bioplasma cannons glowing with predatory hunger. Bastion saw at the tactical display, her mind racing. The jump had been too perfect, the trap too well sprung. It was not a mistake. It was a betrayal. The enemy was not just ahead of them. It was behind them, beside them, and with a sickening certainty that chilled her to the bone, she realized it was aboard her very own ship. The blind crusade was now flying crippled, guided by the hand of a traitor who saw damnation as salvation, the rogue traitor vessel. Fortune's Folly was a ship of secrets and scavenged hopes. Captained by the pragmatic and relentlessly avaricious Ignatius Vorn, a distant and disgraced cousin of the famous Canoness, it was a vessel that danced on the edge of imperial law. Its holds were filled with proscribed Xenos tech. Its crew was a motley collection of mutants and deserters, and its navigators charted courses through whispered of ghost routes to avoid tithe fleets and naval patrols. Vorn's business was profit, and his latest venture was a high-risk, high-reward run to the sparsely populated Obsidian Reach, carrying a cargo of illegal rejuvenat drugs for a reclusive planetary governor. His charts, decades out of date, painted a picture of a quiet, forgotten stretch of space. His first sign that the charts were wrong was the planet Orthos. It was supposed to be a small but thriving mining colony, a lonely speck of imperial light. From orbit, the colony's structures were intact, its landing fields clear, its atmospheric processors humming with silent efficiency. But there were no Vox transmissions, no landing beacons, no replies to his increasingly agitated hails. A deep-range Auspex sweep revealed the impossible: 0 life signs. Not just human life. 0 biological life of any kind. No insects, no bacteria, no flora. The world was sterile. Probably a viral purge, Vorn grumbled to his first mate, a hulking ab-human named Grok. Damned inquisitorial overreach. Scared our client off, most likely. We'll try the next system over. Pyre 4. Nothing but agri-workers there. They're always desperate for distractions. Pyre 4 was even more unsettling. It was a world of continent-spanning fields of grain, now turned a uniform, brittle brown. The vast, automated harvesting machines stood silent in the fields, some of them frozen mid-action, their clawed arms full of dead crops. The hab blocks in the central settlement were empty, the doors left swinging in the wind. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, just an eerie, profound emptiness. Voron's landing party reported back that the only things left were bones, picked clean and scattered like pale gravel. Every scrap of meat, every ounce of biomass had been scoured from the planet. A cold joie of fear began to tighten in Vorn's gut. This was not the work of a virus, nor a military action. This was something else, something methodical and hungry. He gave the order to seal the ship and prepare for an immediate departure, his cargo of illicit goods forgotten. The true terror began when his navigator, a frail, twitchy man named Lyra, refused to enter the warp. He was found huddled in the corner of his sanctum, his third eye clamped shut so tightly that veins bulged on his mutated forehead. He was rocking back and forth, muttering a single word over and over. Silent, silent, silent. What is he talking about? Vorn demanded, shaking the man by his silken robes. The Imperium, Captain. Lyra whimpered, his visible eyes wide with a unique, soul-deep terror that only a navigator could know. It's not there. The currents, the tides, the whispers, they're gone. It's a hole, a dead spot, like a patch of ocean with no water. To open a portal here would be to open a door into absolute nothingness. We would be unmade. They were trapped. adrift in a region of space that had been psychically lobotomized. The silent Blight, which, to the Imperium at large, was a strategic threat, was to the crew of the Fortune's Folly a suffocating, existential prison. Days turned into weeks. They drifted from system to system within the blighted zone, hoping to find a system on the edge, a place where the Empyrean's tides might still be felt. Each world they found was the same, a silent tomb, picked clean of life. The psychological toll was immense. The ship's astropath, a woman named Inessa, was the first to break. Without the familiar chorus of other minds, without the guiding light of the Astronomicon, her mind, trained to exist as part of a galactic whole, began to unravel. She complained of the crushing silence, claiming it was a physical weight pressing in on her. She would spend hours screaming into her psychic amplifier, trying to send a message, any message, and receiving only a terrifying, soul-devouring echo of her own thoughts. She was found one day having gouged out her own eyes, babbling that she could still see the emptiness, and it was looking back. The crew, a collection of hard-bitten cynics and rogues, began to succumb to a deep, primal fear of the dark. They had spent their lives traveling the void, but the void had always been a noisy place, filled with the background chatter of the warp and the distant light of imperial faith. This new void was different. It was a true, absolute nothing. Men began seeing things in the shadows of the corridors, flitting shapes at the edge of their vision. Paranoia became rampant. Fights broke out over imagined slights. The ship's Geller field generator, normally only activated for warp travel, was turned on at full power, its low hum a desperate ward against a silence that felt more threatening than any daemon. Ignatius Vorn, a man who had faced down orc freebooters and traded insults with Kroot mercenaries, found himself terrified of his own ship. The familiar groans of the hull, the hum of the life sustainers, all seemed too loud in the crushing absence of any external input. He spent his days staring at the star chart, at the string of dead systems they had visited, a trail of breadcrumbs leading from the edge of the Blight to their current, trapped position. He realized, with a jolt of ice in his veins, that they had been following the Kroot's path, but in reverse. They had sailed directly into the heart of the wound. The end for the Fortune's Folly came in the Valerius system. As they limped towards the fifth planet, their supplies dwindling and their sanity in tatters, the auspex chimed with an alert. A ship. A single, small vessel, drifting dark and silent. Hope, a feeling long forgotten, surged through the bridge. A derelict, perhaps. Something to scavenge. A chance. As they drew closer, the ship's configuration became clear. It was an Imperial Cobra-class destroyer, but its hull was scarred and pitted, not with weapons fire, but with what looked like acid burns. Great, ugly, organic-looking tendrils snaked across its armored plating. It was a carrion ship, a survivor from some forgotten battle. "Hail them," Vorn ordered, his voice cracking with disuse. There was no reply. "Scan for life signs," he commanded, a sense of dread returning. The tech adept at the Auspex console turned, his face pale. "Captain, there are life signs, hundreds of them, but they are not human." Before Vorn could process this, a section of the destroyer's hull slid open, not like a hangar bay, but like a wound parting. From the darkness within, a swarm of small, winged shapes detached and accelerated towards them. They were Kroot, but twisted into winged gargoyles, their leather-like wings beating silently in the vacuum of space. They carried no weapons, but their purpose was clear. They were boarders. The crew of the Fortune's Folly fought with the courage of despair. But their autoguns and stubbers were no match for the fury of the starved, feral Kroot. The boarders were not the disciplined soldiers who had taken Gathalamor. They were what was left of the Crusade's scavengers, broken off from the main fleet, their connection to the hive mind severed. They were just hungry. They swarmed through the ship, their rampage a whirlwind of claws and beaks. Ignatius Vorn died on his bridge, a rusty chainsword in his hand, facing down a Kroot hunter that was already feasting on Grok's arm. His last sight was of the silent, star-dusted void outside his view screen. A beautiful, terrible, and utterly empty expanse of space that had become his tomb. The echoing void had claimed another victim, its silence not an absence of sound, but the sound of a galaxy being slowly, methodically devoured. The bridge of the divine right was a vortex of controlled chaos. Explosions blossomed silently in the void outside the main view screen as Kroot bioplasma incinerated the sword-class frigate. Stalwart. Red alarm runes pulsed across every console, and the calm, synthesized voice of the ship's machine spirit recited a litany of catastrophic damage reports. The shield of Saul, the pride of Battlefleet Pacificus, was being systematically dismantled in a trap it had willingly entered. Lord Admiral Bastion stood amidst the chaos like a statue in a storm, her orders snapping through the din with icy precision, directing damage control teams, coordinating fighter wing launches, and trying to salvage a coherent battle line from her mauled and disoriented fleet. But as she fought her battle of ships and plasma, Lord Inquisitor Arian Vex was fighting a different war. He stood apart from the command throne, his augmetic eye glowing as it processed 1,000 streams of data. The jump had been too perfect, the enemy's position too ideal, the navigator's sudden, serene confidence. It all coalesced in his mind, forming a pattern of terrifying clarity. He remembered the report from Magos Ven, filed just before the jump. The death of specimen Kappa 7, the unusual synaptic discharge. It was not a random biospasm. It was a weapon, a psychic stiletto slipped between the ribs of the crusade. Lord Admiral, Vex's voice cut through the clamor, his tone devoid of alarm, but heavy with absolute certainty. Cease all Vox transmissions to the navigator's spire. Seal the tower. Post Kasserkin kill teams at every entrance with orders to shoot anything that tries to exit. Bastion turned, her face a mask of fury and confusion. Inquisitor, I am in the middle of a fleet action. My navigators are the only ones who can guide us out of this death trap. Your navigators are the ones who guided us into it, Vex stated flatly. He strode to the command throne, his presence radiating an authority that silenced the nearby bridge officers. The creature we captured, it did not merely die. It sent a message. A mimetic virus, a heresy of pure logic, aimed at the only minds on this ship capable of receiving it. Your navis nobilite has been compromised. They are no longer servants of the Imperium. They are converts. The implication was so monstrous, so utterly unthinkable, that for a second no one moved. The idea of the ancient, insular, and fiercely loyal navigator houses turning traitor was a foundational crack in the structure of the Imperium. But Bastion had served alongside Vex long enough to know he did not deal in hyperbole. She saw the cold, hard truth in his unblinking gaze. She gave the order. The purge was swift and brutal. The navigators, in their newfound fanatical serenity, offered little resistance. They met the stormtroopers' bolt pistols not with fear, but with a look of profound pity for their unenlightened executioners. Paternova Khan was found seated in his sanctum, his third eye binen and staring, not at the warp, but at some internal vision of glory. His last words, whispered to the commissar who held the pistol to his head, were, "You are saving the flesh, but you are damning the soul. The great feast is salvation." The immediate effect of the purge was catastrophic. With its navigator houses executed to the last man, the shield of soul was now truly, hopelessly blind. They had fought their way out of the Kroot ambush, but at a terrible cost. A quarter of the fleet's escort vessels were gone, and 3 capital cruisers were crippled. They were adrift, unable to enter the warp, a flotilla of ghosts in a silent, hostile system. In the strategium of the divine right, a council of despair was held. The surviving ship captains, the Astartes chapter masters, and the grim-faced Colonel Cord, who had been evacuated from Gathalamor with the last handful of his Cadians just before the planet was completely overrun. All looked to Bastion for a plan. There was none. The crusade was a failure. The Kroot had taken Gathalamor and would now be feasting on its choir, preparing for their next inevitable jump towards the Segmentum Solar. The Shield of Sol was a broken weapon, its purpose unfulfilled. It was into this atmosphere of utter defeat that Vex spoke, his voice cutting through the gloom. He activated the central hololith, which shimmered to life, displaying the familiar map of the Segmentum. The spreading stain of the silent Blight was a cancerous wound upon it. "We have been fighting the enemy's war," Vex began, his augmetic eye tracing the Kroot's path. "We have been reactive, chasing them from one disaster to the next. That ends now. We cannot outrun them. We cannot outmaneuver a foe guided by psychic instinct. Therefore, we must make them come to us. We will set a trap so perfect, so irresistible, that their every biological imperative will scream for them to enter it." He zoomed the hololith in on a region of space that lay directly between Gathalamor and the Sol system, the Ophidian subsector. It was a region of moderate population, with several dozen inhabited worlds. The enemy follows the brightest lights. So, we shall extinguish all the lights but one. The Inquisitor's plan was one of such colossal, cold-blooded sacrifice that it drew gasps from the assembled commanders. "We will issue a sector-wide decree of evacuation. We will forcibly remove every soul from every world in the Ophidian subsector. We will harvest or execute every nascent psyker, silence every astropathic choir, and create a void, a perfect psychic desert hundreds of light years across." His gloved finger tapped a single star system in the heart of the newly created void. Except for this one, Ophidia Prime, a system with no habitable worlds, notable only for its powerful deep space astropathic relay, the Eye of the Emperor. We will leave its choir active. We will, in fact, bolster it with every astropath Sudriad have left. We will make it burn like a psychic sun in a sea of absolute nothingness. For the silent maw, a creature that navigates by feeding, It will be the only meal on the table, a feast they cannot refuse. And us? Lord Admiral Bastian asked, her voice tight. We are blind. We cannot jump there. We will not jump, Vex replied. We will crawl. We will travel to the Ophidian system on conventional drives. It will take years. We will arrive long before the Kroot, whose own path is more circuitous. We will power down our reactors, vent our atmospheres, and hide our fleet within the system's dense asteroid belts. We will become an anvil of silent, cold iron, waiting in the dark. The evacuation of the subsector will be the single greatest logistical undertaking in this segmentum's history. Billions will be displaced. Worlds will be left to ruin. The cost will be unimaginable. But when that Kroot fleet, fat and arrogant from its victory at Gathalamor, arrives to feast on the choir at Ophidia Prime, we will be waiting for them. We will have the element of surprise, and we will achieve complete and utter annihilation. Silence reigned in the strategium. The sheer, inhuman scale of the plan was staggering. To sacrifice an entire subsector to create a wasteland of dead worlds, all for the chance to set a single ambush. It was a strategy born of utter desperation, a final, terrible calculus of sacrifice. Lord Admiral Bastian looked at the faces of her commanders. She saw shock, horror, but also a grim understanding. They were beaten. Their crusade was a failure. This monstrous, desperate gambit was the only path left. It was a choice between sacrificing a limb to save the body or watching the whole body perish. Make it so, Inquisitor, she said, her voice barely a whisper, sealing the fate of billions with 4 words. Begin the evacuation. The shield of Saul has a new destination. We will become the anvil. The Ophidian system was a place of cosmic violence. A young, blue-white star, Ophidia Prime, blazed at its heart, its stellar winds howling through a treacherous and chaotic labyrinth of asteroid fields. The shattered remains of a dozen stillborn planets. It was a navigator's nightmare, a place of gravitational shears and unpredictable debris flows. It was the perfect place to hide a fleet. For 3 years, the Shield of Sol had lain silent and dormant within the densest of these fields, the Serpent's Coil. Its ships were ghost ships, their reactors cold, their crews surviving on emergency life support and iron-willed discipline. They were a fleet of frozen tombs, waiting for the moment of resurrection. The bait, the Eye of the Emperor relay station, orbiting the system's dead second planet, burned with a holy, irresistible light. Bolstered by the surviving astropaths from the fleet and those evacuated from the surrounding subsector, its psychic scream was a beacon of pure, concentrated soul stuff, a siren song of exquisite agony that echoed across the now silent void of the Ophidian sector. The arrival of the kindred of the silent maw was just as Vex had predicted. They did not translate from the warp in a single cohesive fleet. They bled into reality in waves, their grotesque bioships shimmering into existence on the system's edge. They had grown. The biomass of Gathalamor had been put to use, and their fleet was now a third larger than the one that had fled the crippled shield of Saul. At its heart, larger and more monstrous than ever, was the grave womb, the throne ship of the prophet-shaper Cathach. From his living command nexus, Cathach tasted the psychic beacon. It was glorious, a vintage of pure, unadulterated power that promised a feast beyond any he had yet known. His every instinct, the deep-seated Kroot drive to evolve, and the insatiable tyrannid hunger he had assimilated, screamed at him to consume it. He saw no threat. The system was empty. The surrounding void was silent. His victory at Gathalamor and the crippling of the Imperial fleet had made him arrogant. He ordered his fleet forward, a great, hungry spear aimed at the heart of the system. Aboard the Divine Right, Lord Admiral Bastian watched the Kroot fleet advance on the long-range passive augers. Her hands were steady on the arms of her command throne. For 3 years, she had held this fleet together through sheer force of will, drilling her crews in cold start attack protocols until they could perform them in their sleep. "All ships," she spoke into the fleet-wide comm, her voice a low, dangerous whisper that broke 3 years of silence. "Reactor startup. Sequence Omega. Prepare to awaken the iron." Across the Serpent's coil, 100 Imperial warships came to life. Plasma reactors ignited in contained blue-white suns. Turrets, frozen for years, ground into position. The void, once silent, now hummed with the latent power of a crusade reborn. As the first Kroot ships, the smaller, faster hunter vessels reached the orbit of the astropathic relay, the trap was sprung. The shield of Saul erupted from the asteroid field, a wave of vengeful steel and righteous fire. Lance batteries, their beams the pure, incandescent wrath of the God Emperor, lanced out across the void, gutting the lead Kroot ships before they could even register the attack. Squadrons of Starhawk bombers, their bays filled with city-killing plasma bombs, swarmed from the launch bays of the Imperial cruisers. The Kroot fleet, strung out in a long, arrogant line of advance was caught completely by surprise, their vanguard shattered in the first salvo. The space around Ophidia Prime became a charnel house. Crute war spheres, tough and resilient, turned to face the ambush, vomiting streams of bioplasma and launching swarms of their gargoyle-like fighter organisms. But the Imperial fleet, fighting with the cold fury of a cornered predator, was relentless. The macro cannons of the divine right spoke, and a crute vessel that looked like a monstrous chitinous crustacean cracked open, its internal atmosphere venting in a cloud of frozen ichor. But Cathach was not just a brute. He was a synaptic commander of incredible power. Recovering from the initial shock, he asserted his will over his fleet. The chaotic Crute response solidified into a coherent strategy. Larger, heavily armored bioships moved to screen the more vulnerable vessels, absorbing the lance strikes on their massively reinforced carapaces. Swarms of smaller craft surged forward, ignoring the capital ships to target the engines and bridges of the Imperial frigates and destroyers, attempting to cripple the fleet's maneuverability. The battle was tipping onto a razor's edge when the second, hidden blade of Vex's plan was revealed. High above the swirling vortex of the fleet engagement, a golden light bloomed. It was not the fire of an engine or the detonation of a torpedo. It was the impossible, brilliant flash of teleportation on a scale rarely seen outside of the Sol system itself. A single vessel, a golden blade of a strike cruiser that bore the unadorned sigil of the Adeptus Custodes, materialized from the Imperium, the Sol's vigilance. And from it, another wave of teleport flares erupted, this one aimed directly at the heart of the enemy fleet, at the pulsating, monstrous form of the Grave Womb. Aboard Cathach's throne ship, the air itself seemed to tear. In a blast of golden light and ozone, 10 figures appeared in the Prophet Shaper's cavernous command chamber. They were giants, clad in auramite armor that seemed to drink the profane light of the bioship. They were the Emperor's own companions, the 10,000, the Adeptus Custodes. At their head was Shield Captain Valerius, his guardian spear held at the ready, his magnificent eagle-crested helm surveying the chamber's fleshy, pulsating walls with cold, utter contempt. Their mission, sanctioned by the Captain General on Terra itself, was not to win the battle, but to cut the head from the serpent. Cathach reacted with inhuman speed. The chamber's floor erupted as his personal guard, a dozen hulking Crute carnifexes fused with the genetics of Tyrant Guard, burst from their slumbering pods. They were monsters of bone plate and scything talons, and they charged the golden giants. What followed was a battle of myths. The custodes moved with a grace and speed that belied their massive size. They were not just soldiers. They were artisans of death. Valerius's guardian spear was a blur of motion, its power blade cleaving through chitin and bone as its integrated bolter roared, blasting craters in the charging bio-monstrosities. One custodian, armed with a sentinel blade and presidium shield, stood like a fortress, absorbing the crushing blows of a Crute carnifex before severing its legs with a single, perfectly timed sweep of his sword. The custodes fought not as a squad, but as 10 parts of a single, flawless killing machine. But Cathach had not been idle. As his guard bought him precious seconds, he rose from his throne, his immense, mutated body detaching from its fleshy pillar with a wet, tearing sound. He was a god of stolen flesh, his 6 scythe-like limbs unfolding, his eyes burning with the combined psychic might of a Norn queen and a billion consumed souls. He unleashed a psychic blast, a wave of pure, concentrated hunger and despair that crashed against the custodes' minds. It was the same attack that had broken the Imperial Guard on Gathalamor. Against the minds of the 10,000, it failed. Their souls were fortresses, their minds forged in the light of the Emperor himself. The psychic attack washed over them, and they did not even flinch. Valerius, his guard having dispatched the last of the Crute abominations, advanced on Cathach alone. The 2 figures, one a golden demigod of order and duty, the other a grotesque avatar of consumption and profane evolution, faced each other in the heart of the dying ship, surrounded by the apocalyptic chaos of the space battle raging outside. "Abomination!" Valerius's voice boomed, amplified by his helm. "You have feasted on the children of the Emperor. Now you face his wrath." Cathach shrieked, a sound of pure, psychic rage, and lunged. The Prophet Shaper and the Shield Captain met in a clash that would decide the fate of a crusade. The duel within the grave womb was a conflict of fundamental principles. Shield Captain Valerius was precision, economy of motion, 10,000 years of martial doctrine perfected into a living art form. Each parry of his guardian spear was an equation of force and angle, each thrust a final, absolute solution. Cathach was chaos, a whirlwind of alien fury. His 6 limbs, a combination of crushing claws and razored talons, struck like a hailstorm, each blow capable of shearing through adamantium, each driven by a mind that saw the battlefield in 1,000 different probabilities at once. Valerius was a golden statue amidst the storm, his auramite armor deflecting the hurricane of blows. Sparks flew as chitinous claws scraped across blessed sigils. The deck plates, made of hardened resin and bone, cracked and shattered under the force of their battle. The 9 other custodians formed a perfect, circular perimeter, their spears and axes a wall of impenetrable gold, effortlessly cutting down the lesser Kroot warriors that swarmed from the ship's fleshy corridors in a desperate attempt to aid their master. They were an island of imperial certainty in a sea of biological horror. Cathach was faster, his movements a blur of unnatural celerity. He scored a glancing blow on Valerius's pauldron, the talons leaving deep gouges in the sacred gold. But Valerius was stronger, his every block and counterthrust delivered with the inexorable force of a tectonic plate. He was not just fighting a monster. He was passing judgment. With a fluid, spinning motion, he evaded a pincer-like claw strike and drove the butt of his spear into one of Cathach's leg joints. The sound of cracking bone echoed through the chamber, and the prophet shaper roared, this time in pain, as his leg buckled. "Your strength is stolen." Valerius's voice resonated with cold condemnation. "Your form is a blasphemy. You are nothing but a parasite, bloated on the lives of better beings." Enraged, Cathach abandoned physical attacks and unleashed the full, terrifying power of his mind. He focused the entirety of his psychic might not on Valerius's soul, but on his body. Bio-lightning, sickly green, and crackling with stolen life force, erupted from Cathach's cranial crest and slammed into the shield captain. The energy did not burn. It tried to unmake. Valerius's armor sizzled, the holy machine spirit within his war gear screaming in protest as the alien energy attempted to rewrite its sacred code, to turn the aura might into cancerous flesh. The air around the custodian thickened as the very oxygen molecules were twisted into poisonous, new configurations. Valerius stumbled back, his golden armor flickering, a grunt of effort escaping his vox grill. He was fighting not just a creature, but a localized warp storm of biological corruption. He knew he could not withstand such an assault for long. He had one chance. Ignoring the debilitating aura, he braced himself, planted his feet, and channeled the entirety of his being, his faith, his centuries of devotion to the master of mankind, into a single, final attack. He charged forward, into the very heart of the bioelectric storm, his armor now glowing with an inner golden light that pushed back against the profane green. Cathach, shocked at the custodian's resilience, tried to bring his scythe limbs to bear, but he was too slow. Valerius plunged his guardian spear through the center of Cathoc's chest, the power field of the blade vaporizing chitin and flesh. The spearhead, a work of artifice beyond compare, punched through the prophet shaper's back and embedded itself in the fleshy pillar of the command throne behind him, pinning the monster like an insect in a collector's case. For a moment, there was silence. Cathoc looked down at the golden spear, transfixing him. A look of profound, alien shock in his multifaceted eyes. Then he began to laugh, a wet, gurgling sound that was broadcast telepathically to every being in the system. It was not a laugh of mirth, but of ultimate, spiteful victory. "You have slain the vessel," his psychic voice echoed in Valerius's mind. "But the feast is eternal." With a final, convulsive shudder, Cathoc's body detonated, not in a physical explosion, but in a psychic one. It was the death scream of the Norn queen he had consumed, a wave of pure, concentrated Empyrean energy, amplified 1,000-fold by the devoured souls of Gathalamor's choir. It was a psychic supernova. The shockwave hit the custodes like a physical blow, their armor ringing like funeral bells. It was only their supreme mental fortitude that kept their minds from being shattered into insanity. But across the wider battlefield of the Ophidian system, the effect was apocalyptic. Every astropath on the Eye of the Emperor and aboard the Imperial ships died instantly. Their heads exploded in showers of blood and bone, their minds utterly annihilated by a force they could not even comprehend. The navigators aboard the Crute ships, those few who had been captured and enslaved, suffered the same fate. But it was the effect on the active, warring fleets that was most devastating. Every Imperial ship, guided through the chaos by its bridge crew's connection to their vessel's machine spirit, suddenly went haywire. The shock wave was a burst of pure, information-scrambled chaos. Cogitators failed. Targeting augers went blind. Plasma reactors threatened to overload as their control spirits were driven momentarily insane. The shield of Saul, in its moment of triumph, was struck deaf, dumb, and blind. The Crute fleet, directed by Cathoc's singular consciousness, suffered a worse fate. With their prophet shaper gone, the synaptic web that bound them together was not just severed, it was vaporized. The synapse shapers clutched their heads and collapsed, their brains burned out. The Crute carnifexes ceased their rampage and stood dumbly, reverting to the instinct of hunted animals. The entire Crute fleet, once a thinking, unified predator, was instantly reduced to a scattered collection of leaderless beasts. Aboard the Divine Right, Lord Admiral Bastion was thrown from her throne as the ship's artificial gravity flickered. Red lights flared across her console. "Status!" she roared. "Complete system-wide failure, Admiral!" her flag captain yelled back over the scream of dying machinery. No helm control, no weapons, no augers. We are blind and adrift. Bastion looked at the view screen. The battle had ceased. Both fleets were crippled, drifting aimlessly amidst the debris of their conflict. The Shield of Saul had won. They had killed the enemy commander, but in doing so, they had sacrificed their own nervous system. The Kroot fleet was still massive, its ships damaged, but largely intact. Without Cathoc's mind, they were just animals, but they were still dangerous, and they would scatter. A plague of monsters spreading to 1,000 worlds. They had won the battle, but were about to lose the war. Her face set in a mask of terrible resolve. Bastion gripped the arms of her throne and keyed her vox to the ship's engine room, its channel hardwired and independent of the bridge systems. Her voice was calm, clear, and absolute. "Chief Enginseer, this is the Lord Admiral. I am giving you my final command. Sanction Alpha Omega. Disengage all safeties on the primary plasma drive. Link the containment fields to my throne's command key. We are going to light a new sun in this system." A moment of stunned silence from the engine room. Then, a single, solemn reply. "Understood, Lord Admiral. For the Emperor." Bastion looked out at the broken fleets. Her fleet, her victory, her sacrifice. She saw the golden glimmer of the Custodes strike cruiser, already moving to retrieve its warriors from the dying grave womb. They had done their duty. Now, she would do hers. "All hands, this is the Lord Admiral," she broadcast over the ship-wide emergency speakers. "It has been my greatest honor to serve with you. The Emperor protects." With a final, steady breath, she slammed her fist down on the command key. The Divine Right, the glorious flagship of the Blind Crusade, pitched its nose towards the blue-white glare of the Ophidian star. Its engines, freed from all mortal constraint, flared with a light that outshone the sun itself. It became a kilometer-long lance of pure, holy energy. A final, defiant prayer aimed at the heart of a star. The victory was Pyrrhic, a word that felt too small for the scale of the sacrifice. It was a victory bought with the soul of a fleet and the fire of a sun. The end of the Divine Right was a moment of terrible, silent beauty. It did not explode in a conventional sense. As the unchained energies of its plasma drive overwhelmed its very structure, it simply dissolved into a streak of pure, white-hot energy. A man-made comet on a collision course with a god. Its final journey across the Ophidian system was brief, but every ship, Kroot and Imperial, that still had functioning optical sensors tracked its incandescent passage. It was the fleet's funeral pyre, a final salute from its commander. When the battleship struck the chromosphere of Ophidia Prime, it acted as a trigger, a cosmic detonator. The young, volatile star, already unstable, was pushed past the brink. It convulsed, its surface rippling with shock waves of stellar fire. Then, with a flash that bleached all color from the void and overwhelmed every sensor in the system, it went supernova. A wave of pure, elemental creation and destruction expanded outwards at a fraction of the speed of light. It was a perfect sphere of incandescent plasma, stellar radiation, and vaporized star matter. It was the universe's ultimate cleansing flame. The ships closest to the star, the core of both the Kroot and Imperial fleets, locked in their deadly, paralyzed embrace, were the first to be unmade. They did not melt or burn. They were sublimated, their adamantium hulls and chitinous carapaces turned to component atoms in less than a microsecond. The great, crippled forms of lunar cruisers, the hulking bioships of the Kroot, the drifting debris of 100 smaller vessels, all were erased from existence, their passing marked only by a flicker of exotic energy in the face of the expanding fireball. Further out, on the fringes of the battle, survival was a matter of luck and physics. The Golden Strike cruiser of the Adeptus Custodes, the Soul's Vigilance, had already translated back into the Empyrean the instant Valerius and his warriors had teleported back aboard. They were witnesses to the star's death from the insane, swirling safety of the warp. Their duty done, their part in this grimy, sacrificial war concluded. A handful of Imperial vessels, those that had been fighting on the absolute periphery, or whose machine spirits had recovered just enough to execute a frantic, short-range jump, managed to escape the supernova's main blast. The Black Templar's battle barge. Eternal Crusader, its hull already blackened by battle scars, managed to ride the very edge of the shockwave, its Geller field groaning under the strain of shielding against a wave of pure reality. It emerged into the void beyond, its port side hideously scarred and melted, half its weapon batteries fused into useless slag, but alive. A few other ships, mostly swift frigates and destroyers, managed similar escapes, their crews battered and broken, their ships little more than drifting wrecks. The Shield of Saul, once a mighty armada of over 200 ships, was now reduced to a squadron of less than a dozen survivors. The Kroot fleet, lacking the discipline and technology for such a desperate escape, fared far worse. Their synaptic web was gone, their prophet shaper, a psychic memory. They were leaderless, directionless beasts. When the star died, most of their ships were still drifting aimlessly in the heart of the system and were utterly annihilated. But a small percentage, those that had been on the trailing edge of their formation, were far enough out to survive the initial blast. They were horribly battered, their organic hulls scorched and blistered, their delicate biosystems flash-cooked by waves of radiation. These surviving Kroot vessels, perhaps 30 or 40 ships of various sizes, were now truly a carrion fleet. The complex ecosystem aboard each warsphere was shattered. The higher-order creatures, the synapse shapers, and the Kroot carnifexes had mostly been driven mad or catatonic by the psychic death of their creator. The remaining Kroot hunters reverted to their most basic, primal instincts, survival and hunger. With their prophet gone and the grand crusade of holy assimilation now a forgotten dream, they became what they had always been, but without any of the cunning or mercenary discipline that had once defined them. They were spacefaring locusts, a scattered plague of monsters with no higher purpose than to find the nearest source of biomass and consume it. Their great warships, now little more than armored nests for feral beasts, began to drift apart, their sublight engines pushing them on random, desperate courses into the now unguarded space of the Ophidian subsector. Inquisitor Arian Vex watched the death of the star from the bridge of the Imperial Fist's strike cruiser. Phalanx Wall, one of the few ships to have survived. He felt no triumph, no relief. He had stood on the precipice of defeat and thrown a star at his enemy. It was a victory of such catastrophic proportions that it felt like its own kind of failure. He had destroyed the head of the serpent, but in doing so, he had chopped its body into 100 venomous pieces, now slithering away into the dark. He looked at the tactical display, at the red runes representing the fleeing, scattered Kroot survivors. "The crusade is over," he said, his voice a dead, emotionless rasp. "The scouring begins." Colonel Cord, his face illuminated by the flickering red of the alert runes, stood beside him. What little was left of his Cadian 101st was aboard this very ship. "My men are ready, Lord Inquisitor." "They will not be enough, Colonel," Vex replied, his gaze unduly distant. "This is no longer a war to be won with laser guns and bayonets. This is a pestilence, and it requires a quarantine. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Ophidia was not a triumphant consolidation of a hard-won victory. It was a frantic, desperate scramble. The shattered remnants of the Shield of Soul, a ghost fleet crewed by shell-shocked survivors, began the grim task of hunting down the scattered Kroot vessels. It was a slow, bloody business. Each Kroot ship was a floating charnel house, a maze of dark, fleshy corridors filled with starving, feral monsters. Boarding actions were costly, brutal affairs, fought in silence against an enemy that no longer knew strategy, only hunger. The once proud Imperial fleet had been reduced to the role of cosmic exterminators, their grand crusade ending in a series of grim, thankless cleansings in the dark. The war was won, but the front had not been shattered. It had dissolved, becoming 1,000 tiny, festering wounds across the whole of the blighted sector. In the aphasic silence that followed the Ophidia supernova, the long, slow work of the Inquisition began. While the battered remnants of the Shield of Soul hunted the larger Kroot carrion ships, Lord Inquisitor Arian Vex dispatched his own acolytes and tech magi on a far grimmer mission. He sent them back along the path of the silent Blight, back to the worlds that had been its victims, from Gathalamor to Quire Primus and beyond. Their task was not to offer aid or resettlement. There was no one left to help. Their mission was to conduct a post-mortem on a dozen dead worlds, to understand the true nature of the plague that had passed through. The first reports were uniformly chilling. The landing teams, clad in heavy biohazard gear, walked through cities of silent, empty streets, their footsteps echoing in vast, deserted plazas. They found what the crew of the Fortune's Folly had found. Bones picked clean, technology left untouched, and an unnerving, absolute sterility. The Kroot had been terrifyingly thorough. They had consumed everything, from the human population down to the last microbe in the soil. These worlds were not just dead. They had been autoclaved. It was on the forgotten agri-world of Viridia II, one of the earliest victims of the Blight, that the first anomaly was discovered. A team led by Magos Biologis Skrevos, a tech priest whose devotion to cataloging life was matched only by his detachment from it, was conducting a deep soil analysis. The world was, as expected, a biological vacuum, except for one valley. Tucked away between a range of blasted iron mountains, Skrevos's sensitive augurs detected faint but unmistakable signs of biological activity. He led his team into the valley on foot, the air still and thin. The valley floor was covered in a strange, rust-colored moss that crumbled to a thin, spore-laden dust under their armored boots. The moss was not native to Viridia II. In fact, its genetic structure was unlike anything in the Imperial archives. It seemed to draw sustenance not from photosynthesis or soil nutrients, there were none, but directly from the planet's geothermal radiation, a trait that hinted at a terrifyingly robust design. Deeper in the valley, they found more. Strange, fungal-like growths, resembling great, fleshy polyps, sprouted from the barren rock. They pulsed with a slow, rhythmic light. And when Scrivos' servo skull attempted to take a sample, the polyp contracted violently, spraying a cloud of viscous, acidic slime that dissolved the servitor's casing in seconds. The true horror lay at the valley's heart. There, in a shallow crater, was a grove of what looked like skeletal, black trees. They had no leaves, only a complex lattice of thorny, chitinous branches. Hanging from these branches, like grotesque fruit, were pulsating, semi-translucent sacs, each the size of a man. Inside the sacs, suspended in a thick, amber fluid, something was growing. Scrivos adjusted the magnification on his optical sensors and felt a cold knot of binary dread clutch his logic circuits. The things in the sacs were fetal, but their forms were already recognizable. They had the lean, avian build of a Kroot, but their backs were covered in rudimentary chitinous plates. Tiny, vestigial arms, ending in scythe-like claws, were tucked against their chests. They were a fusion, a deliberate and horrifying hybridization of Kroot and Tyrannid. The Crusade, Scrivos intoned into his voxcaster, his synthesized voice flat, but carrying a weight of dawning comprehension that chilled Vex to the core when he received the report light years away. It was not merely a campaign of consumption. It was a seeding. They were not just feeding. They were planting. The discovery on Viridia II was a key, unlocking a new and far more terrifying understanding of the kindred of the Silent Maw's ultimate strategy. As Vex's teams revisited the other dead worlds, they now knew what to look for. And they found it. On every world, the Kroot had stripped. From the grandest hive city to the humblest agri-colony, they had left something behind. It was not always as obvious as the Viridian Grove. Sometimes it was just a dusting of microscopic spores, hidden deep in the bedrock, waiting for the right geological or atmospheric trigger. On other worlds, they found huge, dormant eggs, buried like landmines beneath the foundations of ruined cathedrals. Cathak's goal had never been just to reach Terra. That was the pilgrimage, the holy crusade that motivated his followers. But the assimilated Norn Queen's core imperative, the genetic drive that underpinned his every action, was the Tyrannid one: propagate, expand, adapt, diversify. The consumption of biomass was only the first step. The second was to use that biomass and the unique genetic codes within it to create a new and more perfect form of life. The silent blight was not just a trail of destruction. It was a fallow field. The Kroot had scoured these worlds, removing all native life, creating a perfectly sterile incubator. Then they had planted their seeds, the spores of a new hybrid race, a species that would possess the Kroot's cunning and adaptability, but fused with the Tyranids' rapacious hunger and potential for monstrous biodiversity. They were growing a new ecosystem, a new empire of monsters, in the dark, psychically blind patches of the galaxy they had carved out for themselves. Inquisitor Vex stood on the bridge of the phalanx wall, staring at a hololithic display showing the biological readings from a dozen different blighted worlds. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, forming a picture of a strategy so vast, so patient, and so utterly alien that it dwarfed the simple concept of a military invasion. The death of Cathach and the scattering of his fleet at Ophidia was not the end of the threat. In fact, it was the opposite. By destroying the Prophet Shaper, they had ensured his ultimate victory with no central consciousness to guide them. The newly seeded life forms on these worlds would be free to evolve independently. They would adapt to their specific environments, each world giving rise to its own unique strain of Kroot tyrannid horror. They hadn't just decapitated a serpent, they had shattered a vial of viral plague, allowing it to mutate in 1,000 different laboratories simultaneously. The spores of this new heresy had been sown. The victory at Ophidia had been a pyrrhic, meaningless gesture against a foe whose true war was not fought with fleets, but with genes. The Imperium had not won. They had merely pruned a single branch of a tree whose roots were now sunk deep into the heart of a dozen worlds, quietly growing in the silence and the dark. All they had done was buy themselves time, and Vex had a terrible, chilling suspicion that when the children of the Silent Maw finally emerged, they would be far worse than their parents. The final report of Lord Inquisitor Arian Vex, transmitted under the highest possible level of security from the battered phalanx wall to the sanctum of the High Lords on Holy Terra, was not a declaration of victory. It was a confession of failure, a diagnosis of a cancer, and a proposal for an amputation so vast it bordered on the insane. He laid out the truth in cold, uncompromising detail. The true purpose of the Kroot Crusade, the seeding of a dozen worlds, and the birth of a new, hybrid Xenos ecosystem in the psychically blinded sectors. The kindred of the Silent Maw, he argued, had not been defeated at Ophidia. They had merely been dispersed. Their physical fleet was a shattered remnant, but their biological legacy was now a latent, festering empire. The response from the Senatorum Imperialis was a decade in the coming. A decade during which Vex and the ghost fleet of the Shield of Soul waged a grim, thankless war in the dark, hunting down the last of the Kroot carrion ships and confirming the horrifying extent of the seeding on world after world. It was a decade of debate, of astromantic divination, and of political maneuvering between the great powers of the Imperium. To formally seed an entire subsector, to draw a line on the map of the galaxy and declare it lost forever, was an act that had not been committed in millennia. It was an admission of weakness, a wound to the Imperium's very conception of itself as the rightful ruler of the stars. But Vex's logic was inescapable. The blighted zone was now a biological minefield. To attempt to recolonize it would be to invite contamination on a species-threatening scale. To leave it open would be to allow the new hybrid life forms to mature and eventually spill out into the wider galaxy. The only solution was a quarantine, a final, absolute, and permanent one. Thus was issued the Ophidian Decree, a proclamation signed by the seals of the Master of the Administratum, the Fabricator General of Mars, and a dozen other High Lords. The entire region of space, once known as the Viridian Vale and the Ophidian subsector, a wound of hundreds of star systems, was officially redesignated. It was now Imperium Nihilus Secundus, a second empire of night. It was a territory declared perdita and anathema. To enter it was heresy punishable by death. To attempt communication with it was to invite the attentions of the Ordo Xenos. The implementation of the decree was an undertaking on a scale that dwarfed even the Blind Crusade. A new fleet, the Wardens of the Silent Star, was created. It was a permanent quarantine force, drawing ships from battle fleets across the segmentum. Its composition was unique, tailored to its bleak and eternal mission. It was heavy on long-endurance cruisers and swift, heavily armed picket ships. It had no troop transports, for there would be no ground assaults. It had no colony ships, for there would be no resettlement. Its sole purpose was to patrol the borders of the blighted zone, a great circular perimeter thousands of light years in circumference, and to ensure that nothing ever got out. Fortress monasteries of the Death Watch, the elite alien hunters of the Inquisition, were established on key star systems along the quarantine line. These were grim, silent bastions, their watch chapels forever facing the silent, empty void of the Forbidden Zone. Listening posts, crewed by grim-faced tech priests and servitors, were constructed in deep space, their powerful augurs tuned for the slightest sign of biological or technological activity from within the sealed-off region. The quarantine was not a perfect seal. It was a sieve, a net drawn across an ocean of cosmic horror. Small, fast-moving bioships, survivors from the Kroot's scattered fleet, would occasionally make a desperate run for the border, driven by starvation. They would be met by the swift justice of the Warden fleet, their vessels scoured from the void by lance fire and torpedoes, their passing logged by a dispassionate administratum scribe. Rogue traders, drawn by rumors of archaeotech on the abandoned worlds within, would sometimes try to slip past the patrols. They were never heard from again. For the wider Imperium, the silent Blight became a half-forgotten nightmare, a cautionary tale whispered by naval officers on long watches. The official histories, penned by the scribes of the administratum, recorded the blind crusade as a glorious victory. Lord Admiral Evangeline Bastion was posthumously canonized by the ecclesiarchy as a martyr and a saint, her final act of sacrifice held up as the ultimate example of imperial duty. The loss of an entire subsector was spun as a strategic consolidation, a necessary sacrifice to secure the segmentum. The truth, as is so often the case in the 41st millennium, was buried under layers of propaganda and faith. But for those who served on the Warden fleet, for the Death Watch Marines in their lonely watchtowers, and for the aging Inquisitor Vex, who chose to spend his final centuries overseeing the quarantine from his command fortress on the border world of Sentinel, there was no victory. There was only the watch. They stared into the silent, star-dusted darkness of Imperium Nihilus Secundus, a vast, self-imposed black hole on the map of mankind's domain. They listened to the silence, and they waited. They knew that they had not defeated the enemy. They had merely locked it in a room. And they knew that within that room, in the darkness and the quiet, it was growing, changing, and listening back. The war was not over. It was simply in a state of horrific, patient incubation. Centuries passed. The Imperium, in its vast and grinding fashion, moved on. Wars were fought, heroes died, and entire sectors burned. But the quarantine of the Silent Blight held. The Wardens of the Silent Star became a permanent, grim fixture of the Segmentum Pacificus, a fleet of eternal sentinels. The story of the kindred of the Silent Maw faded from active memory into the realm of legend, a terrifying but distant myth used to frighten wayward inquisitorial acolytes. The memory of Lord Admiral Bastion was enshrined in 1,000 cathedrals. Her sacrifice, a gleaming pearl of martyrdom plucked from a sea of forgotten tragedy. The name Cathach was a classified secret, a footnote in the most heavily encrypted databanks of the Ordo Xenos. Within the silent, forbidden zone of Imperium Nihilus Secundus, a new and terrible genesis was unfolding. On the sterile, bone-strewn plains of Quire Primus, the hybrid spores, nurtured by the lingering psychic echoes of the slaughtered Quire, gave rise to a new breed of creature. They were lithe, winged hunters with chameleonic hides that shifted to match the gray dust, their minds attuned to the faintest whisper of psychic energy, making them the perfect psyker predators. On the molten, volcanic surface of Gathalamor, now a desecrated tomb world, a different strain evolved. Here, the Kroot tyrannid organisms were squat, powerful, and armored with thick, obsidian-like plates of cooled magma fused to their flesh. They developed the ability to consume geological matter, their hyper-efficient metabolisms transmuting rock and metal into biological sustenance. They became a race of living forges, their forms dictated by the planet's harsh, fiery nature. On every one of the seeded worlds, a unique ecosystem of horrors blossomed in isolation. With no central hive mind to direct their evolution, they adapted with the savage, ruthless efficiency of natural selection. They fought one another, the strongest strains devouring the weaker in a brutal, planetary-scale crucible. They evolved new biomorpha, new weapons, and new forms of cunning, all in the silent dark. The legacy of the Silent Maw was not a unified empire, but a scattered confederation of nascent, monstrous civilizations, each one a perfect predator for its home environment. The final chapter of the story was written by Inquisitor Arian Vex. He was ancient now, his body more machine than man, his life sustained by arcane technologies, and a will as cold and hard as the void itself. He never left his command fortress on Sentinel, his augmetic eye forever fixed on the star charts that depicted the Forbidden Zone. For 300 years, he had watched, listened, and collated the fragmented reports from the long-range augur posts. He had noted the faint, inexplicable energy signatures, the subtle gravitational anomalies, the whispers of biological activity that the Mechanicus adepts dismissed as sensor ghosts. He knew they were not ghosts. They were the signs of a slumbering monster beginning to stir. His moment of terrible vindication came on the eve of the feast of the Emperor's Ascension, in the final year of the 41st millennium. A priority alert, screaming in panicked binary, came from Watch Station Epsilon, a lonely listening post deep in the Serpent's Coil Nebula, on the very edge of the quarantine line. The station's sole occupant, a tech priest of the Adeptus Mechanicus, sent a single, fragmented, picked capture before the station went silent forever. Vex played the image on the hololith in his private sanctum. The quality was poor, degraded by stellar radiation and distance, but the image was clear enough. It was a ship. It was vast, far larger than any of the old Kroot war spheres, and its shape was a blasphemy of biology and engineering. It had the segmented, armored body of some colossal insect, but its prow was a great crystalline focusing lens, and its flanks bristled with what looked like organic lance batteries. It was a bio-dreadnought, a living warship grown, not built. It was a child of Gathalamor, a creature of rock and rage. And it was not alone. Behind it, emerging from the nebula's obscuring dust, were others. A fleet of smaller, faster bioships that moved with the predatory grace of sharks. They were the children of Choir Primus. The ships did not power up a warp drive. They did not tear a hole into the Imperium. The lead vessel, the great crystalline dreadnought, simply focused. The lens-like structure at its prow began to glow with an intense, internal light. It drew in the ambient, psychic energy of the system, the faint, residual echoes of life, and compressed it. Then, with a distortion of space that registered on Vex's instruments, not as a warp translation, but as a localized fold in reality itself, the entire fleet vanished. They did not jump into the warp. They had evolved beyond it. They had perfected the Silent Maw's original method of travel, turning themselves into living, biological blink drives. Vex knew where they were going. He did not need astropaths or navigators to tell him. They were a new species, born in silence and darkness, but they carried an ancient, inherited memory in their very genes. A fragment of the Norn Queen's unfulfilled purpose passed down through Cathach, and now blooming anew in his monstrous descendants. They were going to Terra. The legacy of the kindred of the Silent Maw was not ash, but a seed. A seed that had been planted in the Imperium's own backyard, nurtured in a prison of its own making, and had now blossomed into a threat far greater than the original. The blind crusade had not prevented a war. It had merely delayed it, and in doing so, had allowed the enemy to evolve into something far worse. Arian, Vex, the last living architect of the Ophidian victory, stood alone in his chamber, the ghost image of the new Xenos fleet hanging in the air before him. He broadcast a single final message to the High Lords of Terra, a message of warning that would be the last act of his long, bitter life. The children of the Maw are coming. His voice, a dry, mechanical rasp, echoed across the segmentum. They have evolved. They walk in silence, and their hunger is for the throne. May the Emperor have mercy on us all.